Thanks for sharing your time with us today, and certainly thank you, Tom, for being here from NetRise. We have a great topic today. As Paul mentioned, we're going to talk about device security, and it's really a relevant topic, and it's certainly is timely, and it seems like everybody's talking about device security these days. So thanks for being here, Tom. I really appreciate it. Hey, CEO, co-founder and CEO of NetRise Inc. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about NetRise?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. So yeah, as Steve mentioned, I'm the CEO of NetRise. I started my career off in the Marine Corps, doing not cybersecurity things, but I went on to do security engineering at a big bank, worked for the Department of Energy doing industrial control system security, where I was responsible for managing various vulnerabilities and risks associated with our ICS devices. And then I went on to Cylance, where I did incident response, ICS consulting, as well as kind of a technical overlay for the entire company for products and services and whatnot. And here at NetRise, we're basically providing visibility and risk identification to IoT devices, a class of devices that consist of IoT, ICS, medical devices, embedded systems in vehicles, satellites, and telecommunications equipment. So everything but laptops, desktops, and servers, essentially.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you with us, Tom. I'm Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGi. ASMGi is a partner of NetRise in the spirit of full disclosure, right? So we have a saying at ASMGi, a total solution is the program plus the technology plus the operations, and certainly the technology in this case is NetRise's, right? So we'll wrap our services around that and deliver NetRise as a fully managed service. So anyway, that's here's what we're going to talk about today. We'll do some introductions, already done pretty much, a little bit of a session overview. I want to go through some trends, just some statistics about devices and those kind of things. And then Tom will go through a series of Q&A, and you'll have an opportunity to elaborate on a few different things and open it up for questions from the audience. So as Paul mentioned earlier, feel free to submit questions when you think of them, and please use your QA box if you can, or use the QA box on the Zoom platform if you can. And some of them we'll get to right away, and some of them we'll put off till the end, and then we'll do some closing remarks. So from a statistics standpoint, I think pretty much everybody has seen this before, but by 2025, there's projected to be 75 billion devices. That's a lot of devices. Currently, in 2022, there's 42.6 billion devices. That's, in 2015, there were 15.5 billion devices. So pretty much a 5x, growth curve over a 10-year period. Pretty phenomenal. 42.6 billion today, over 75 billion in 2025. So that's the one thing I'll say about devices is the proliferation of devices, right? There's just so many of them. They're bound to have vulnerabilities, right? And as we see more of them, there's going to be more vulnerabilities. They're just are. And from an attack surface perspective, I think it'll continue to increase in those kind of things. So this slide, the stat about quantitatively how many devices there are it's the same information, but what really jumped off the page for me was the challenges in IoT, and particularly, 3 of those challenges related to cybersecurity. And it's worth saying out loud, 85% of developers, right? So 85% of developers are rushing IoT products to market and probably not considering, or they're not properly secured, right? So I look at this as a systematic problem. There are people that are, getting devices out that aren't secure. There are legacy devices that are already in play that are not secure. So IoT products on the market have vulnerabilities, right? So the products that are already on the market, 70% of them have vulnerabilities. So if we look at that, the former slide, right? I don't know what were there, 46.2 devices in total. 70% of those have vulnerabilities, right? So there are 32.3 billion devices out there with vulnerabilities in them that could be exploited. So in 2025, 3 years from today, theoretically, there'll be 75 billion devices and 70% of them will have vulnerabilities, right? So it's a real problem. IoT products, or Americans, they don't update their firmware, or some Americans, 60% of Americans don't update their firmware, right? That's a pretty powerful stat if you think about it, right? So as consumers, like doorbells, a lot of people have smart doorbells, right? The Ring doorbells and stuff. They probably have firmware that they update periodically, right? Nobody ever installs an update in those kind of things, right? So there's in any event, what do you think about this, Tom? It just seems pretty phenomenal to me, and there's a huge problem here, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's, the number of devices that people have in their homes is only going up and up. And to have the expectation that people are going to update these devices on their own is just an unreasonable one. I mean, I do a good job of updating my firmware, but I better. So, if some of these vendors admittedly kind of force you to update things or just kind of do it on their own, but that is still like generally the exception in my experience. If you look at like your router or your TV, things like that, those typically require you to have to do something. Same with your printer. For things like, I don't know, security cameras and things like that, that's a bit more mixed, where they'll push them or have you do it yourself. But the idea is, this is something that people just aren't doing. So it's incredibly important to significantly reduce the amount of risk that is put in these devices from day one.
Yeah.
As you can see, that's also not happening. So it's a problem if one of these things exist, for sure, but it's a much bigger problem if all of them exist. So if we're rushing products to market and people aren't updating their firmware, that's a problem. If we're not rushing products to market and we're making sure that we're releasing like the most secure product we possibly can, then the fact that people aren't updating their firmware is less of an issue. But when both of them are true, it's just like, we should not expect good results at the end of the day. And we aren't getting good results at the end of the day. So that frankly just shouldn't even be a surprise to people. But somehow it is, I think.
Right. Well, and I think what's happening is item number 3 on this slide, right? A lot of times businesses, they look at the value and the perceived benefits, or the real benefits or perceived benefits, right, of adopting a certain approach or technology, and don't necessarily consider the added risk or the cybersecurity of those devices. And certainly that's no exception here. And what really jumped out to me was 25% projected savings by the healthcare industry from the use of IoT. So, we know that the trend now is more towards digital health than ever, right? Based on COVID and those kind of things. 25% of operating costs for the whole industry. That's a lot. So 25% of a lot is a lot, right? So we don't have real numbers here to work with, but 25% of a lot is a lot. So
yeah,
go ahead.
I think to comment on that, the whole digitization, of manufacturing, the IT/OT convergence, all of that in the same way that you have like digital transformation in the enterprise, right? A fancy word of saying moving to the cloud, and removing applications from being on-prem into a more SaaS-based platforms. That's what's happening here, right? All of these IoT devices, by their definition, are in the internet, or connected to the internet rather, which means that almost certainly they're SaaS-based solutions. So, but once again, this is one of those things that's very confusing to me. I mean, I know the answer, but nonetheless, even though I know the reason why, it doesn't make it less confusing, I suppose. These companies that are going through digital transformations to the cloud didn't do so all willy-nilly, right? Like security was a huge pillar of that transition. Why is that not the case for IoT? If you think about healthcare, and I mean, there's no doubt about it, the cost savings that are, I mean, these savings are probably even more pronounced in like manufacturing and, fit like more like physical industries. So manufacturing, oil and gas, power and electric, like all those kind of things. And yet at the same time, those are the industries where the by far biggest impacts can occur from a cyber event. And yet the same level of visibility, analysis, and effort to reduce those risks is not present. Right. But whenever we're migrating from on-prem Exchange to in the cloud Office 365, we better make sure every T is crossed and I is dotted, and we've hired 25 consulting companies to come in and make sure there's no vulnerabilities. But if we're going to outsource our patient monitoring systems to a SaaS provider and make sure that all of our security cameras monitoring an operating room, well, let's just buy the cheapest one we can and hook it up. And let's just hope for the best. Yep. It's like this weird, dichotomy that seems to exist, that because a user is not directly assigned to a particular thing, we don't attribute that thing with the same level of risk as we would a traditional device like a laptop or desktop.
Right. Yeah. And I think, part of that thinking, that mentality that goes into that process is that devices are somehow different, right? And they're connected to the network, right? So the vulnerabilities are very, very exploitable. You can get to them from the outside. They're connected to the internet today, and all kinds of various different things. I wanted to go through just a couple more stats, and this one I'll say is a little bit less exciting to me, but the size of the market. I think what was interesting here was that the trend is mapping to the number of devices, quite honestly, right? So that's it's exciting. But this I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting to me because the more billions of dollars being spent on those devices means more money going to be spent on securing those devices. Like, this is the way what's fascinating to me is it's not like this is a new paradigm, right? We all had computers were a thing 25, 30 years ago. Were they secure? Not really. Are they like orders of magnitude more secure now? Of course they are. So did we learn our lesson? Of course not, because we never do, right? That's human beings don't do a great job of not repeating mistakes. So right. There's no difference, right? A lot of these devices are running Windows, but what version of Windows are they running in a lot of cases? Windows XP. Well, what? Or they're running a version of Linux that is 10 years old, or using software components that are 20 years old. Like, it can't get more basic than that. And yet we're just like, hope is not a military strategy, but it is the one that we seem to be employing here.
Right. I hear you. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
What I think was interesting about the threats and the concerns worldwide were the number one thing. So about a third of the people that were polled around the world were concerned that an IoT attack might be critical, right? It might impact critical operations. That, think about it. There were a lot of critical operations in the OT world. And I think XIoT encompasses all of the, the smart home, the smart building, the manufacturing environments, the process control environments, and those kind of things. But the lack of security was number 2 on the list, right? The lack of talent, the lack of skills in cybersecurity, or lack of skilled personnel with those skills was the number 2 concern. And it's still about a third of the people around the world are concerned about that. Protecting sensitive data that these devices are creating, right? So there are a lot of manufacturing plants who are, putting manufacturing 4.0 processes in place and generating very sensitive proprietary data, right? They don't want that to get out. but yet they put devices in play that are not secure, or they're connecting, things to their network that are not secure and those kind of things. So, but in any event, I wanted to get to some Q&A, Tom, so that we'd have some time to really drill in and ask you some questions. So you just came back from Black Hat. I just wanted to ask you first and foremost, what was it like at Black Hat for the week? You spent a week there, right?
Yeah, I was out there for 7.5 days or so, primarily because I'm a masochist, I think. Yeah, I was there for Black Hat and I was there for DEF CON. Both were great. Significant difference compared to last year. Last year was very dead, which I quite frankly enjoyed. We were very, very early last year. This year we launched our product. We had a big dinner with a bunch of clients and partners and whatnot. And so I was obviously very happy that the conferences were significantly more well attended this year. And yeah, I mean, as you kind of called out here, I appreciate it. CSO Online called us out as being a top cybersecurity product that was unveiled at Black Hat this year, which is a humbling and amazing thing, especially when you consider some of the other organizations that are on that list that are enormous public companies. So needless to say.
Yep. How did that go down, Tom? Is that something you had to apply for? Or did they just kind of notice the products that were there and really get excited about the problem that you were solving? Or just how did it happen and what exactly happened?
Yeah, so I think there's a handful of things. Number one, we've been making a fair amount of noise in this space. The IoT security space is an enormous one. If you look at companies like the Clarities, Nozomis, Armises of the world, there's a huge focus on OT security as well, medical device security, and we are going after all of those markets. Those are all markets that we care about. So we're not just focused on one particular device type or one particular industry vertical. So I think that is appealing to folks.
Yeah.
So I think there was a lot of that. We did have I quite frankly could not believe the amount of, not only the quantity of booth traffic was really, really good, but the quality of it. Everyone who came over to talk to us knew what we did, understood the use case, and basically wanted to try out our technology. So we came out of Black Hat with a ton of net new opportunities.
I wanted to ask you, Tom, specifically about this platform, this technology that you're talking about, because there were a lot of technologies that analyze network traffic and identify that there's a device on the network. Maybe it's new, maybe it's existing, but they identify that a device is on the network and categorize it a certain way. And, some of them you named, like Clarity or Order or Armis. Yep. Those, they have very sophisticated classification engines, right? But you do something a little bit different from a vulnerability standpoint, right? So why don't you talk about that a little bit? Because I think it's important that the audience knows what's special about your platform.
Yeah, and I think you might have a slide on this, Steve, but we come about this problem from an inside out perspective. So if you look at the asset inventory device identification companies that we just referenced, which would also include, like vulnerability scanning companies, these are all enormous companies that have very, very, amazing solutions, but they just don't do what we do. It's just a totally different approach. So we provide visibility from the inside out, and the only way to really do that is by analyzing the firmware of those devices. Traditional security technologies cannot provide the same visibility and risk identification because you can't install an agent on a security camera, on a printer, on a programmable logic controller, on an ECU in a car. Now, I say that as a generalized blanket statement. There's exceptions to these things. There are some companies out there creating like micro agents and things like this, but that's a very, very challenging endeavor, not only from a like technical perspective, but it's a magnificently long sales process from a go-to-market perspective.
Right. And there were already $42 billion devices in play.
Yeah, I mean,
so it's probably not going to work for them.
And frankly, I think we might get there eventually where that's something we do look at doing, but doing that at like the outset of a company like ours, I think is just not the right approach. The right approach that we see, as is the case in many security technologies and solutions, is the thing that's most important initially is getting as much visibility as possible, right? And that's what we do. We provide you with as much visibility into that device as possible. And that's not just vulnerabilities. That's also weak or default credentials, expired certificates. Did we find both public and private keys? We also just added recently the ability to identify misconfigurations, so we can map those misconfigurations to compliance frameworks and audit standards and all kinds of fun things like that. So that is the power of what we do, is giving you visibility and identifying risk in a class of devices that historically has had none.
Yep, got it. So let me get to another question. So I think you had a bunch of features that you were going public with or releasing as part of that Black Hat event. Do you want to talk about those?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I touched on a few of these, but I think the continuous monitoring thing is incredibly important. So, I've done a lot of this work in my past life, whether that was at Cylance or Department of Energy or whatever, where we were basically just doing consulting engagements for organizations to find vulnerabilities and things like that. Listen, we did great work. Clients were happy. It was wonderful, but it was such a snapshot in time thing. If it wasn't being done in a continuous manner, the other problem was scalability, right? You can only handle so many of these. The talent to be able to conduct these kinds of engagements is super rare, super expensive. So we knew that automation here was just like an absolute requirement, and that's a problem we've solved. Generating a software bill of materials, an SBOM is a huge, issue right now, I guess. In the federal government and a lot of these other critical industries, such as like healthcare, manufacturing, and industrial control systems, all of that. So we generate a software bill of materials for you in the most common formats, Cyclone DX and SPDX. We identify misconfigurations like I talked about. We started off with around 6 of them. We're going to have probably at least 100 of them by the end of the year. We give you an overall risk score. So those are some key points. Another really important point here is we're giving people a lot of vulnerabilities that they were not aware of that exist in their devices prior to us being involved. And so what we knew was, listen, we can do this, but we also have to give people a way to prioritize this information.
Prioritize those, right?
We have to, right? We can't just be like, hey, here's 3,000 vulnerabilities and we wish you well.
That's
right? Like, hey, sort them by critical based on the NVD. No, that's a terrible approach. So we brought in around 40 to 50 additional fields from a data enrichment perspective that allows us to prioritize this information. Right. How many of these
is it based on risk-based vulnerability, like establishing, a true risk score? And the metaphor that I always use is like an outdated operating system, like Windows 2003 or Windows XP you mentioned, right?
Yep.
A Windows XP device that's external to the network and exploitable from the outside is way different than an XP installation that is not reachable from the outside world or exploitable, right? So from a risk-based vulnerability standpoint, you have to evaluate those things as well and just really understand what the risk is. Not the CVE score is going to be identical for both of those systems, right?
Right. No, that's right. So one of the other things we do is bring in things like, are there exploits available? Are they weaponized? Are they being used in the wild? Are any of these vulnerabilities associated with ransomware groups? Are any of them associated with particular threat actors? But to your point about like the contextual aspect of these devices, we are building integrations with some of our key partners that we talked about in like the asset inventory space. So now we can leverage our information with their information to give you a much more holistic risk posture around this device. Is it in the corporate network? Is it already VLAN'd off? Or is it connected directly to the internet? Because based on those factors, will either increase or decrease the overall risk of that device. Exactly.
Cool. How important would you say is device level security, right? How important is being able to identify vulnerabilities at the device level?
So, I mean, obviously, we think it's paramount. The idea that, you know, a lot of these technologies that exist right now in the space, once again, these are all amazing technologies. And I agree with, if I was them coming out with a solution at the time, I would have done the exact same thing they did. Like whenever Armis came around, as an example, doing firmware analysis for those devices probably was too early, right? Is what I would say. So their solution makes perfect sense. It's an incredible one. It's very clearly a market leader. Now, what I would say is, no one makes the statement, hey, I have a firewall or I have a network-based intrusion detection system, so I don't need endpoint security. No one says that, right? No one says I have a firewall, so I don't need to scan for vulnerabilities on my laptops, desktops, and servers. Zero people in the world say that.
Right.
So why would you say that about these devices? I don't know. There's no good answer. The answer is you shouldn't say that. I think the answer is this. Previously, you did not have a solution available to you that was able to shine a light on those risks and the vulnerabilities within those devices, but now you do. That's really what we've come around to find out from an enterprise use case perspective. Right. Device manufacturer use case perspective, different. They've known about this problem for a long time, right? Because they're the one creating the problem essentially, or mitigating the problem to the best of their abilities. So that is the kind of the point we make is if you have EDR, if you have antivirus, if you have host intrusion prevention systems, if you have DLP on your endpoint, if you have an umbrella proxy if you have all of these other things installed on your endpoints to mitigate or remediate the risks associated with them, why don't you at least have visibility into the risks associated with all of these other devices that by definition, we've deemed them to be critical, right? Like for critical infrastructure, like the devices running critical infrastructure, we don't have the same visibility into those as we do Steve in accounting's laptop. That seems like an uneven balance to me.
Right. Yep. Yeah, and I think a lot of it is based on like how you categorize an asset, right? So IT and OT, we know has been that the debate has been in existence for a long time, and I think the awareness that OT devices haven't had security integrated into them has been around for a long time. People have known that, right? So there were certain industries who were leveraging air gaps for security and those kind of things. But today, it's paramount to understand that they're being connected to the internet, right? They're being connected to the network. So it's really the same as any other, as an IT asset, right? So, but I think a lot of our focus over the years has been really on IT-based security, and all of those devices. When you talk about a smart home and IoT devices, it's a little hard, it can be a little tricky sometimes to categorize them. And I think that's where the term XIoT came from, right? It can be a little tricky to categorize them. Is it an IT device? Is it an OT device? Is it somewhere in between? Is it its own category? Is it brand new, or those kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very thankful for the team over at Clarity for coming up with XIoT, because that's way easier to say than IoT, ICS, medical devices, satellites, embedded systems in vehicles, and telecommunications.
To list them all off.
Right.
Yeah, I get it.
It's much easier to just say XIoT, and then you write a blog about it, and you say, if you want to know more about it, I send them the link to the blog, and then they understand. So, and people even get crazy with it, like industrial IoT, and like you can keep going down this hole of acronyms.
Yep. Yeah, I want to talk specifically about this, and you alluded to it previously, and we we took one of your blogs and we posted it on ASMGi's website, and I think it's a really good perspective on, you know, not just what you do, but an outcome, right? So there, and basically what it says is this: we did a test internally, right? And there was a device that has firmware on it, and there was an enterprise class scanner that was used to scan the device, and it found 5 vulnerabilities, right? 5 vulnerabilities. And then there's NIST has a public CVE database. It's called CVD, I think, right? The NVD. I'm sorry. The public vulnerability database basically is what it boils down to. It showed 2 vulnerabilities, right? And then NetRise found 142 vulnerabilities. Huge difference. So what had occurred to me when I thought about this example is that there's a CIO somewhere or CISO somewhere that's saying, hey, don't worry, I got this covered, right? I've got an enterprise class scanner that found the vulnerabilities and we fixed them, right? But my comment would be there's 137 more, right, that you didn't fix because you didn't even know about. So in any event, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this example. And I'm curious about that 137 or 35 vulnerabilities that weren't found and weren't part of that public database. What are those? And not specifically like list off 135 things, but if you can talk a little bit about what they are and you know how they're categorized.
Yeah. So yeah, this is we've talked about this a lot. This is the notion of basically vulnerability disparity, right? And so the additional vulnerabilities we identified were identified as a result of identifying software components within the firmware itself. So software components like OpenSSL, BusyBox, glibc, numerous open source software components that exist in hundreds of millions or billions of devices. So the first step is identifying that component based on a somewhat hilarious amount of complexity to identify those components in some cases. Sometimes it's very kind of straightforward and simple, and sometimes it is just like a pretty big nightmare. We take that and then we look those up in the NVD, as well as we leverage multiple other sources of information to kind of aggregate all of that vulnerability information and then surface that basically. So, but the way we are doing this, or I should say rather, these are known as, you know, some people be like, wow, you found that many 0 days. No, that's not what we're saying at all. These are not 0 days. These are what are known as end day vulnerabilities, which means the vulnerabilities we've identified in this device are not new, but they are not properly associated with that device in the National Vulnerability Database. And the way that that association exists is what is known as a CPE, Charlie Papa Echo, CPE. And so when you look up this device, which is generally a CPE consists generally of make, model, and in this case, firmware version, you would only find 2 vulnerabilities associated with this device. Well, I mean, listen, the best company in the world isn't releasing a device that only has 2 vulnerabilities. It's just not like possible. You're using way too many third-party pieces of code and libraries and dependencies and all of these other things. And that's not a slight to the manufacturers here. This is an impossible problem, right? Like generally speaking. So that is what we're basically shining a light on here. Now, there's countless devices that don't even have a CPE entry at all in the National Vulnerability Database, which means what? By definition, there would also be no CVEs, also known as vulnerabilities, associated with that particular device. So we have come across thousands of these devices where no CPE is present for that particular device. And so therefore, if you are an end user or a potential end user of that device, and you want to ascertain the level of risk associated with that device, and you look it up in the NVD, you're going to find nothing, which tells you what? Wow, this company does a great job.
Yeah, right.
Usually the complete opposite is true. If there are no vulnerabilities, that means there probably is no product security team. And even if there is a product security team, they're not doing product security. So, yeah.
Cool. And this is, so I'm curious, like, how do you evaluate or how do you ascertain the vulnerabilities in a piece of firmware? Maybe I should probably go to the next slide, because the next question to you is really like, what's the benefit of finding the vulnerabilities in firmware, right?
Yeah. So I think the better question here is like, how do I operationalize this data, right? And there's a million different ways. Vulnerability management augmentation. So, we are not trying to take the place of a Rapid7, a Tenable, a Qualys. That's not what we want to do at all. We want to augment those existing solutions. Incident response purposes. So if you look at Log4j, which is still a thing, and the next Log4j type vulnerability comes out, what is your current approach to that? Because I guarantee you it's basically reaching out to the manufacturers, waiting for their response and hoping that their response is good. What we can tell you is we identified Log4j in multiple device manufacturers where those manufacturers basically said, hey, we're in the clear, we don't have Log4j. Do I think that they were lying? I don't think that they were lying. I think that they just didn't have visibility into the software components of the devices that they make, because it's a hard problem. So that's the other piece. So you can save hundreds and hundreds of hours when the next vulnerability comes up, and you can move from a reactive vulnerability management posture to a proactive vulnerability management posture as it comes to firmware vulnerabilities. Another piece here is enhanced or directed monitoring. So if we identify, let's just say, a device that has 10 weaponized exploits for vulnerabilities present in that device, we can integrate with whatever, Palo Alto or some other like network intrusion detection system technology that exists, and basically say, make sure that we're monitoring this particular device, this particular subnet, VLAN network, whatever, and that if any exploits for these particular vulnerabilities are seen, like, let's make sure we alert and elevate that even more, or make sure that those exploits are being particularly monitored for. Sometimes those firewalls have a limited rule set where it can only monitor for whatever, X number of exploits or something like that. So we can make sure that these exploits are the ones being monitored for. Other things you can do, like rotating credentials and things like that, if we find weak ones or default ones, that's a huge mitigation you can put in place. And then the last one I would mention, and there's more, but I could talk about this forever, would be third-party risk management and procurement use cases. So if you know that you're going to be going out and buying whatever, new security camera, a new printer, new router, new whatever, you can basically upload the firmware into our platform, and we can help you ascertain the level of risk associated with that device before you implement it into your environment.
Right. And what I would say in general is you can't do anything about it if you don't even know it exists, right? So if you know it exists, then you can either not switch vendors, right? Pick a different vendor, or put compensating controls in place, right? So or remediate the vulnerability, right? Get a patch from the vendor and install it, or do whatever.
Yep.
Cool. So I want to open it up for some audience questions, and we've got a few, so bear with me, and I'll kind of get through those a little bit.
I see them here as well, Steve. You want me to go through them?
Cool. Yeah, please.
Sure. So the first question is, interested in use cases and deployment options per vertical if possible. I can certainly provide that. I mean, depends which vertical you're talking about. It also depends what kind of market, if you're talking about a device manufacturer versus end user of that device. As an example, if you are an automotive manufacturer, your use cases are not going to be the same as you know, a company buying that car, right? Like it's just going to be different. Are we interested in carrier 5G and MPLS protection? So I'm not sure if I understand this question perfectly, but if the question is, do we care about like the infrastructure supporting 5G in these bigger like carrier networks? 100%, right? That is a huge market for us, and one that we care about a lot, and that we can do really good analysis in. If the other question here is, do we care about MPLS layer network protections for edge devices? Absolutely, right? I think that would provide us a very strong like partnership opportunity there with those kinds of companies. So that would be interesting. The second question I have here is, what's your stand regarding zero trust versus vulnerability identification? I think zero trust is an incredible idea, I guess. To me, zero trust is the new whitelisting, like application whitelisting. Like we all went through that phase about 10 years ago. It's a real thing. It clearly is a very strong candidate for how to architect and orchestrate environments and networks. My concern is that implementing and operationalizing it correctly can be challenging, right? That's the problem, I think, with it. It's not like when I write it on a piece of paper, I'm like, this is genius. This is an unbelievably good idea. We should do this. And then whenever you go get the tools to do it, you're just like,
right. It's hard. It's hard. And I think people have a different understanding a lot of times, multiple.
But there's 100 definitions of it. That's the other problem. You know, and I've seen 5 companies who say they're doing zero trust, and it's 5 just totally different things. And I'm just like, which one is actually zero trust? So like I said, huge fan of the concept of zero trust. The federal government is enormously huge behind zero trust as well. So yeah, big supporter of that for sure.
Yeah.
But vulnerability doesn't mean we should.
Yeah. What I would add to that, Tom, just to kind of bolt on to that response, even the federal government, it's zero trust and vulnerability management. Nobody says you don't have to do vulnerability management if you do zero trust. You don't have to do zero trust if you do vulnerability management. It's both, right? It's an and, not an or.
Yeah, yep, I think that's right. I mean, if you look at like if you talk to like zero trust absolutists, though, they will say, we don't care how many vulnerabilities are on this thing because we don't trust it anyways, right? And that's fine. That's actually fine if you manage to implement zero trust perfectly.
Right. And I think that's an ideal, quite honestly, because there's always a way in, and the general consensus in security is not if, but when, right? So
and that's also operating under the assumption that there is zero risk associated with zero trust solutions.
That's right.
Which is not the case, right? Firewalls have vulnerabilities. Sorry to break everyone's hearts.
Right.
You know,
yeah.
Like,
so
that's
yeah. Right.
Another question here is in a medical device security, if any cyber attack occurs, how to differentiate the data which might change during the attack. It might be possible that the physiological signals of the patient may be changing is also, it might be an attack. Yeah, that's a very difficult question to kind of answer in a vacuum. This brings up the question of like trustworthiness of data and how do I trust things like that. But what I would generally say is these kind of things have to be done like after the fact, generally speaking, to do like root cause analysis on, okay, what happened on this device? And that can be shortened by orders of magnitude by having the kind of data and visibility that we can provide. So if there is any indication or any question that, hey, we think potentially this patient monitoring system had been compromised, okay, that's a problem. Right. Well, Do we know what vulnerabilities are on it? Well, yeah, we uploaded the firmware into the NetRise platform. Great. All right, we found 25 critical vulnerabilities. 4 of them have been weaponized. We found default credentials. We found this, and this, and this. That will, based on what those findings are, either increase or decrease the probability of that was actually what happened to cause some, real world harm to that particular patient or whatever.
Right.
Use cases.
Yep. And theoretically, what I would add to that is that if you put thresholds on the physiological data, then you would know that there's an anomaly, right? So you're outside of that range, and then there's probably something going on. Maybe you're attacked, maybe you're not. But as far as what data is good and what data is bad, that's not something that we would, I identify. That's a design criteria, right?
Right. And I think this is where those integrations with these partners come into play, right? So in this case, we'll talk about Order or MedSec or companies like that. So having both the outside in and the inside out perspective is really what you want.
Yep. I had a couple more questions, Tom. I wanted to just throw out there and get your input on real quick. There's I'm gonna combine a couple of these and summarize them a little bit, but the OEM manufacturer of a device versus owner operator, right? Who's the solution for, and who's responsible for security?
The answer to both of those questions is both. So we market to both the device manufacturers and the end users of the devices. Who is responsible for the security? Well, obviously, on the front end of that process, the device manufacturer is responsible for the security of that device. And you, as an owner of a device, are now responsible for that device in your environment, right? And I get pushback on that sometimes, which is insanely confusing to me, because nowhere else in life is that true. Whenever you buy a laptop and you put it in your environment and it gets hacked, like, you don't call Dell.
Right. Like at home, for example, right?
You don't call Microsoft.
Right.
Like, that's not what happens. Because what do? You spend millions of dollars securing that laptop and putting XDR solutions on it and putting a firewall in front of it and doing this and this. You do all of these things to secure these devices. So whenever people are like, no, that's the manufacturer's responsibility. Since when? Right. Since when have you purchased a device, purchased anything, and been like, you know what? Whatever happens to me is their fault. I mean, there's negligence, there's corporate malfeasance, there's things like that where companies are making a claim that this does not negatively impact people and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, that's a different story, right? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, hey, I am company X. I did my best to bring this product to market in a secure manner. I have sold it to you. I can't do it. It's yours now. And so I'll send you updates at some interval, and that's really it. So the responsibility here falls on both parties for both of those.
Gotcha. Just one more question, then we'll move on and wrap up. I need the solution. This is what the question basically said. I need the solution, right? I don't have the resources to do vulnerability management of devices myself. How do I solve the problem? Do you offer a managed service, or how do I solve the problem?
Yeah. So we totally understand that the cybersecurity workforce is not exactly flush with talent these days, potentially even less so for this particular problem. And so, what you alluded to, we do offer, like a managed service to come in and help operationalize the platform, build processes and workflows, build amendments to your existing vulnerability management program, and then work with amazing partners like ASMGi, who have incredibly smart humans at their organization that are able to help augment our organization, right? We don't have an army of firmware security consultants. So this is where partnering with folks like yourselves is a really critical part of our go-to-market and of ensuring the success of the implementation and operationalization of our data and platform in their environment.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the kind words, by the way.
No
And
problem.
we can help. We can help you. We can help you solve this problem. Tom's got some amazing technology to solve real problems, and we can help. So I want to talk real quick about an offer for all the attendees on the webinar. Does everybody know what an SBOM is? It's software bill of materials, and there's a specific format that they have to be delivered in to really align with the frameworks that are out there. And you do align with these, Tom. So we're going to offer that up as a giveaway to the attendees on the webinar. If you want one, please just email me directly. We'll send the slides out, or just put your email address in the chat box, or just say I want to take advantage of this offer. But please do so, or send an email if you want to. I want to talk about some upcoming events real quick. ISA, that's the International Society of Automation. I sit on their board. We've got a couple of events coming up in September. For the Cleveland section, we're going to do a presentation on manufacturing 4.0. And then we also, the Third Party Risk Institute, which is headquartered in Toronto, Canada. Linda Tuck-Chapman runs that organization. I know her really well. So they've invited me to participate in a Ask the Expert session. So that'll be really cool. ISA National. This particular division is headquartered in Houston, and we're going to do another discussion about cybersecurity for their Northern Ohio HIMSS. So HIMSS is a healthcare specific organization, but we're affiliated with them, and we're going to talk to and participate in that Northern HIMSS event in October of this year, the Information Security Summit in Cleveland in October. ICS for ICS, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but I think S4 is another venue that you attended this year, Tom. Next year, we're going to, I've been involved in this ICS for ICS, and we're going to talk about various different incident response techniques and how to integrate FEMA and Department of Homeland Security into incident response, as well as NIST 800-61R2. But that said, and AI Med, which is it's a medical healthcare specific tech program around AI in medicine, and we're going to get involved from a cybersecurity standpoint with them. We did a show this year in San Francisco, and next year we'll be in San Diego as well. So anyway, that's all we have for you. Any closing remarks, Tom?
No, I did get one more question about, is this on-prem or in a cloud? It's a 100% based cloud-based solution. There is no on-prem currently. So cool. And then for the other question I got from Mohamed, I'll share contact information with Steve. I'll reach out to you on LinkedIn as well, or feel free to ping me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thanks all for attending today.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Let us know if you're interested in the SBOM. Thanks, Tom, for all your wisdom again.
No problem, Steve. Thank you for having me. Talk to you guys soon.
Cheers.
See ya.
Bye-bye.